We must hold on to what we know to survive this.
There are kinds of knowledge that frighten people more than weapons. Not because of what that knowledge can do, but because of what people believe it can do. In the antebellum South, where power was kept through fear, silence, and forced ignorance, a slave who could think was far more dangerous than a slave who could fight. Strength could be beaten, bodies could be chained, but knowledge had no shackles. It moved quietly from mouth to ear, from hand to hand, spreading in whispers after dark like a fire no one could see until it was already burning. This is the story of a woman whose understanding of the natural world became so exact, so undeniable, that it terrified the very people who claimed to own her. A woman whose hands could heal or destroy depending on which leaf she picked from the forest. A woman who never shouted, never rebelled, never raised a fist, yet made powerful men lock their doors at night and taste their food with shaking hands. Her name was Annie Turner. And what she knew made her the most feared slave in Tallahatchie County, Mississippi. Annie Turner arrived at the Hartwell plantation in the spring of 1838. No one knew where she came from. No one knew who had owned her before. She appeared in Natchez at a slave auction like a shadow with no past attached to it. Thomas Hartwell, a wealthy cotton planter whose fortune had grown quickly in recent years, purchased her along with several others. The official records still exist in the county archives. They list her as Annie, female, approximately 16 years, field hand. No birthplace, no family, no history, just another body bought and sold. But Annie was not like the others who arrived that spring. From her very first days in the cotton fields she behaved differently. While the other slaves kept their heads down and their hands moving, Annie watched everything around her. Her eyes followed birds as they landed on certain flowers. She noticed which weeds grew strongest near the water and which dried up in the sun. She touched leaves carefully, rubbing them between her fingers, sometimes lifting them to her nose as if memorizing their scent. She kept seeds in her pockets. An elderly woman named Ruth noticed this first. Ruth had lived on the Hartwell plantation for nearly 40 years. She was the healer of the slave quarters. When someone had a fever or a wound or a sick child, they went to Ruth. She knew the woods well enough to keep people alive with teas and poultices passed down through memory, not books. One summer day a young boy named Samuel developed a deep rattling cough that would not go away. Ruth prepared her usual remedy, a tea made from wild cherry bark and honeysuckle. As she worked, she felt Annie watching her. "You studying my methods, girl?" Ruth asked, not unkindly. "Just watching," Annie replied softly. "That cherry bark. You are using too much." Ruth froze. She turned slowly. "And how would you know such a thing?" "The bark has poison in it," Annie said calmly. "A little opens the lungs. Too much turns the stomach. You should use half that amount. And add horehound, white flowers. Grows dry near the barn." Ruth wanted to scold her, to dismiss her, but there was something unsettling about the way Annie spoke. No pride, no challenge, just certainty. Against her instincts, Ruth followed the advice. The tea worked. Samuel improved within days. After that, Ruth began to show Annie the plants she used. But she soon realized Annie was not learning. Annie was remembering. Once shown a plant, Annie understood it completely. Which part healed, which part harmed, how much crossed the line between medicine and death. By fall Annie had surpassed Ruth. She cured fevers with willow bark. She stopped infections with garlic and pine resin. She eased stomach pain with wild ginger and peppermint. Soon people came to Annie first. She never asked for payment, never demanded favors. She simply listened and walked into the woods. But Annie did something else. Something dangerous. She kept records. Since slaves were forbidden to read or write, Annie created her own system. Carved marks into bark, pebbles arranged in hollow logs, small cuts made into trees in exact patterns. To others they meant nothing. To Annie they were a living library. She recorded where plants grew, when they flowered, what they healed, and what they could kill. Because Annie understood a truth few healers fully accepted. The line between medicine and poison was thin, often no more than a matter of amount. Thomas Hartwell learned of Annie in the winter of 1839 when his youngest daughter Caroline fell ill with scarlet fever. The family doctor bled the child and fed her calomel mercury as was common practice. Each day Caroline worsened. Her fever rose. The rash spread. The doctor warned Hartwell to prepare for loss. A house slave named Martha spoke up in desperation. "There is a girl in the quarters. Annie. She saves children." Hartwell resisted. Then he gave in. Annie stood in the doorway of the sickroom, quiet and observant. She looked at Caroline for a long time. "The mercury needs to stop," she said. The doctor protested. Annie did not raise her voice. "It is poisoning her. She is fighting 2 battles instead of 1. Hartwell looked at his dying child. Then at the calm young woman who spoke without fear. "What would you do?" he asked. And that question would change everything. If you want to hear what Annie chose and why powerful men began to fear her shadow, make sure you subscribe to the channel, like this video, share it with others, and leave your thoughts in the comments. Part 2 reveals the choice that saved a child and sealed Annie Turner's fate. Part 2: When healing becomes a threat. Fear does not begin with proof. It begins with doubt, with whispers, with the quiet moment when people stop asking how something works and start asking what it might really mean. In the slave-holding South, fear was a powerful tool, but it was also a fragile one. And nothing cracked it faster than a slave who knew more than she was supposed to know. Thomas Hartwell's house had never been so quiet as it was when he asked Annie Turner what she would do to save his daughter. "Stop the mercury," Annie said calmly. "Give her willow bark tea for the fever. Use cool compresses with witch hazel on her chest and throat where the rash burns hottest. Give elderberry tea to help her body fight the sickness. Keep her drinking as much as she can." Dr. Foster protested immediately. He spoke of medical training and proper science. He warned that stopping the calomel would doom the child. But Hartwell looked at his daughter's pale face and trembling body and made his choice. The mercury stopped. For the next 2 days Annie did not leave the house. She moved quietly through the rooms like a shadow, brewing teas at exact intervals, changing compresses, listening to Caroline's breathing while others slept. She adjusted her treatments based on small changes that no one else noticed. A shift in skin color. A pause between breaths. A tightening of the jaw. On the morning of the 3rd day, Caroline's fever broke. By the 4th day, she asked for food. Within a week, she was fully recovered. Word spread fast. Faster than Hartwell could control. A slave girl had saved the planter's daughter after a trained physician had failed. Hartwell rewarded Annie with an extra blanket and permission to keep a small garden near her cabin. But the real change was in how he looked at her. She was no longer just labor. She was value. When Hartwell's wife suffered migraines, Annie eased them with feverfew and skullcap. When Hartwell himself was crippled by a kidney stone, Annie's roots and teas passed it within days. Other planters began calling. Hartwell began hiring her out. Annie traveled from plantation to plantation. She delivered babies. She cured fevers. She treated illnesses doctors could not explain. And almost always, she succeeded. That success planted fear. The first true crack came in the summer of 1841 at the Lawrence plantation. Annie had been sent to stop a dysentery outbreak in the slave quarters. She worked for 2 weeks, enforcing cleanliness, preparing medicines, isolating the sick. The outbreak ended, but Richard Lawrence, the overseer, died. He had been a cruel man, known for his violence. He fell ill suddenly after supper. Stomach pain, vomiting, trembling hands, blurred vision. 3 days later, he was dead. Dr. Foster called it cholera, but privately, he admitted the symptoms were wrong. Slaves whispered that justice had finally come. Some noticed Annie had gathered plants near the kitchen garden the day before Lawrence fell sick. No one accused her, but no one forgot either. 6 months later, another man died. George Bentley hired Annie to treat his elderly mother's arthritis. Annie helped her greatly. Bentley grew curious. He pressured Annie for details. She gave him only surface knowledge. Bentley experimented anyway. He harvested poke root incorrectly, used the wrong parts, drank the tea himself. By morning, he was dead. Bentley's widow told people about his notes, about the slave girl's medicines. The story changed as it traveled. Soon it was no longer Bentley's mistake. It was Annie's danger. People stopped seeing a healer. They began seeing a threat. Stories grew darker. Slaves spoke of Annie with awe and fear. White families watched her closely. Some demanded to see every ingredient. Others refused her remedies unless someone else prepared them. Hartwell noticed the change. He also heard the rumors. Quiet talk at dinners. Suggestions that no slave should hold such power. That perhaps Annie knew too much. In the spring of 1843, Hartwell called Annie to the house. "You've made my neighbors nervous," he said. "I only treat the sick," Annie replied. "I do not cause harm." Hartwell asked about Lawrence. Annie denied treating him. Asked about Bentley. Annie explained his mistake. Hartwell believed her. But belief did not erase fear. "I need you to explain your methods," he told her. "Show them everything." Annie agreed. But fear does not fade when explained. It grows. Because the truth was simple and terrifying. Annie Turner could heal. And if she chose not to, people might die. And in a world built on control, that was unforgivable. If you want to hear what happens when fear turns into action and how Annie's knowledge becomes a sentence instead of a gift, subscribe to the channel, like this video, share it with others, and leave your thoughts in the comments. Part 3 reveals the moment when watching her was no longer enough. Part 3 The knowledge that would not leave. Fear is rarely logical. Once it takes root, it grows on its own, feeding on coincidence and silence. By the summer of 1844, fear followed Annie Turner like a shadow. Not because of what she had done, but because people believed she could do something far worse. When a man who had once refused to pay Thomas Hartwell for Annie's services died suddenly of a stroke, people remembered that Annie had been at his plantation only a month earlier. When crops failed on land where Annie had once been treated poorly, slaves whispered that maybe she had done something to the soil. No one could explain how. No one needed to. The truth was ordinary. The man was old and unhealthy. The land had been mismanaged and the summer had been dry. But ordinary truths cannot compete with fear. People began to see patterns everywhere. Annie became the explanation for anything that went wrong. By late summer, several planters approached Hartwell with a solution. They would pay him well to sell Annie to a trader who moved slaves deep into Louisiana. Far away, out of Mississippi, out of memory. They called it a reasonable compromise. No one would be hurt. Hartwell would profit. The problem would disappear. Hartwell hesitated. Annie no longer brought him money. Worse than that, his own household had grown uneasy around her. His wife asked him not to call Annie into the house again. His daughter Caroline avoided her eyes. The girl whose life Annie had saved now crossed rooms to avoid passing her. Before Hartwell could decide, something happened that sealed Annie's fate. One evening in late August, Hartwell ate dinner with his family as usual. Collard greens, mustard greens, fresh from the garden. He complimented the cook and ate heartily. Within an hour, his stomach twisted in pain. By midnight, he was vomiting violently. By morning, his hands shook. His vision blurred. His heart raced. Dr. Foster was called. He examined Hartwell carefully and frowned. "It looks like poisoning," he said quietly. "But I cannot find the source." Constance Hartwell thought of Annie. Everyone did. Even though Annie had not been near the house for weeks. Even though she had not cooked the meal. Annie was sent for. She examined Hartwell calmly. Asked questions. Then asked to see the garden. She knelt beside the greens and then walked to the edge where white flowers grew unnoticed. "White snake root," she said. "It has been growing here for weeks. The poison washes into the greens when it rains. It builds up over time." She explained milk sickness. How the poison attacks the heart and liver. Then she treated him. Hartwell recovered exactly as she predicted. The incident should have saved her reputation. Instead, it destroyed it. People began asking a new question. How did Annie know so much about poison? Whispers turned darker. Some claimed she must have planted the snake root herself. Others said only someone deeply familiar with poisons could identify it so quickly. Logic collapsed under fear. In October, the planters returned to Hartwell. This time they were firm. "It is not what she has done," they said. "It is what she could do." Hartwell understood. Knowledge could not be controlled. And knowledge in a slave terrified them. He agreed to sell her. Annie learned of the decision in early November. She asked only when. December, Hartwell said. "Before the rains." Annie nodded. She spent her final weeks quietly. Teaching the younger women. Sharing seeds. carving final marks into trees. Preparing. Then something strange began to happen. James Crawford fell ill. Headaches. Dizziness. No cause. Then he recovered. William Hughes fainted without warning. Again and again. Then it stopped. Robert Finch dreamed of plants growing inside him. He barely slept. None of the illnesses could be explained. None were fatal. But fear does not need proof. Each man had eaten food prepared by slaves. Each drank water drawn by enslaved hands. The fear spread beyond Annie. People began watching every meal. Every sip of water. Every servant's hand. They began to realize something they had never allowed themselves to consider. They lived surrounded by people they controlled only through violence. People who touched their food, their homes, their lives. And knowledge does not need permission. If you want to hear what happens next and how fear finally breaks into violence, subscribe to the channel, like this video, share it, and leave your thoughts in the comments. Part 4 reveals what happens when Annie Turner finally leaves Mississippi and what she leaves behind. Part 4 The Journey into the Unknown. Some people believe that knowledge is power. Others learn, too late, that knowledge can also be a curse. Annie Turner had lived her life surrounded by fear and admiration in equal measure. Every person she healed owed her something. Every life she saved whispered of her ability. Yet it was not her hands, not her remedies, that frightened people the most. It was the certainty in her mind. The things she knew that no one else could understand. By December of 1844, that knowledge had made her a liability. The planters of Tallahatchie County had decided that Annie could not remain. They would sell her to Morris Hampton, a trader whose wagons carried slaves deep into the Louisiana and Texas territories. Far from Mississippi, far from the eyes that watched her with suspicion, far from the whispers that called her dangerous. Annie received the news as she had received all news in her life, with calm, quiet acceptance. She asked only when she would leave. December, Hartwell told her. The roads would be impassable if she waited longer. She nodded. Nothing else was needed. She had learned long ago that anger and pleading did little to change a situation. The preparations began immediately. Annie continued her work among the slaves, teaching them which plants to gather for winter teas and which roots could be stored for spring illnesses. She distributed seeds from her garden to those she trusted most. She carved the final notches in her trees, leaving a hidden map of knowledge only she could read. Each mark, each scratch, each arrangement of pebbles and leaves was a page of a book no one could ever hold. When the day came, a cold December morning, the air was sharp and still. Annie boarded the trader's wagon without a word. She carried nothing but a small bundle of herbs, a few pieces of personal clothing, and her quiet, calculating mind. The other slaves in the wagon eyed her with a mixture of awe and fear. Even at a distance, they sensed her reputation had preceded her. The journey was long and treacherous. Roads were rough, rutted with mud from winter rains, bordered by forests that seemed endless. At night, Annie watched the firelight flicker on the faces of the other slaves and the traders. She listened to the sounds of the horses and the creaking of the wagon wheels. Her mind catalogued everything: the plants along the roadside, the animals that crossed their path, the weather patterns that could signal danger. Nothing escaped her attention. The traders whispered among themselves about her. Some feared her knowledge, others coveted it. They did not realize that Annie revealed nothing. Not a single secret, not a single remedy. Her silence was a shield, and it protected her more than any chain or lock ever could. By the second week, the wagon reached the borderlands of Louisiana. The air changed. The trees were taller, the rivers wider, the land untamed. Here, she would live in a world where fewer people knew her name, but the stories of her abilities had already traveled ahead like wildfire. Even traders in these territories had heard whispers of the healer who could save children and adults alike, who could see disease before it spread, who knew the difference between a plant that healed and a plant that killed. When they arrived at the plantation where she was to be sold, Morris Hampton oversaw the transaction. He was a large man with rough hands and a keen eye. He examined Annie closely. His traders had warned him of her reputation. He watched the way she moved, the calm in her eyes, and the way she looked at the world as though it had already revealed all its secrets to her. "You are Thomas Hartwell's property," he said, though he knew better than to speak harshly. She nodded. His words held no power over the thoughts inside her head. She had learned long ago that control over her body was limited. Control over her mind was limitless. The new owner was polite enough to the people of the household but kept his distance from Annie. He had heard rumors too. People had died around her. People who touched the wrong plant or ate the wrong leaf had fallen ill. He would not risk testing her. He assigned her to the quarters and allowed her a small plot of land for her garden. It was a recognition, however begrudging, of her abilities. Word of her arrival spread quickly. Neighboring planters came to observe her work. Some sent their slaves to learn from her. Some whispered warnings. Annie listened but did not argue. Her time in Mississippi had taught her that explanations do not always soothe fear. Knowledge alone can terrify, and those who cannot understand it will always try to suppress it. By the spring, Annie had begun her work in earnest. She treated the sick, taught herbal remedies, and guided the slaves of her new plantation in the careful study of the local flora. She catalogued the plants, noting which could cure fever, which could soothe burns, and which could kill if misused. Her method was slow and deliberate, a reflection of her understanding of the delicate balance between life and death. But the shadows of fear followed her still. One morning, a neighboring planter came to her garden, asking questions she chose not to answer. His own curiosity had begun to resemble suspicion. He watched her work closely, recording every step, every plant she touched. Annie noticed his gaze but did not acknowledge it. She let him think what he would. Some things, she had learned, are better left to imagination than explanation. The slaves under her guidance began to speak in hushed tones of her abilities. Stories traveled quickly, and soon even children spoke of Annie Turner with reverence. Yet the fear among the white families persisted. Every unexplained illness, every sudden death, every crop that failed was attributed, in whispers, to her. They had learned in Mississippi to fear the unknown in her hands. That fear had traveled with her, carried across state lines like a shadow that refused to leave. Annie understood this perfectly. She had survived on knowledge, on calm, on observation. And now she would teach those who trusted her not just how to heal, but how to protect themselves from fear. She would teach the next generation the names of plants, the signs of illness, the ways to read the land. She would teach them the power that had made her a target, the power that had kept her alive. In Louisiana, the story of Annie Turner began anew. People whispered that she had been sold, that she was far from Mississippi, that she had started over. But Annie's presence was no longer just about healing. It was about knowledge. It was about survival. And it was about the quiet, undeniable truth that some forms of power can never be chained. If you want to know how Annie's knowledge begins to challenge even the most powerful planters, how her reputation spreads across territories, and how fear grows into something darker, subscribe to the channel, like this video, share it with others, and leave your thoughts in the comments. Part 5 will reveal the moment when Annie Turner faces her first real test in her new home and the consequences of knowledge feared. If you want, I can continue and draft Part 5 next, keeping the suspense and horror elements escalating, so the story stays binge-worthy for your YouTube audience. Do you want me to do that now? Part 5: The Test of Knowledge. Some knowledge cannot be taught. Some knowledge cannot be hidden. Some knowledge demands a test before it can be trusted. Annie Turner had spent her life walking a narrow line between healing and fear. In Mississippi, she had survived because she understood not only plants and medicines but also the way people's minds worked. She knew how fear could twist truth into danger. Now in Louisiana, that lesson was about to face its hardest challenge. It began with a child. A little boy named Thomas, son of a neighboring planter, who developed a sudden high fever one hot March morning. His skin burned, his lips turned dry and cracked, and he shivered violently despite the heat. The family physician had no explanation and could not stop the fever. Panic filled the household. The boy's mother begged the planters to send for Annie Turner, the healer who had arrived months earlier, rumored to possess knowledge no one else dared to claim. Annie arrived immediately. She entered the room quietly, her eyes scanning the child with the calm precision that had always unnerved people. She asked questions, gently examining Thomas without speaking harshly or making promises. She listened to his breathing, touched his pulse, and studied the color of his eyes and skin. Then she left the house to gather her ingredients. As she walked the plantation fields, the shadows of fear lingered in the minds of the white families. They remembered Mississippi. They remembered deaths that had coincided with Annie's presence. They whispered doubts. Could this child survive? Could they trust her knowledge, or was she somehow a threat? Annie worked in silence. She selected plants with careful hands, preparing teas, poultices, and compresses. Every step was deliberate, every ingredient measured to the smallest fraction. She did not speak of poison or danger, only of the cure. Yet the planters and physicians could not help but watch, tense with suspicion. By the second day, the boy's condition worsened. His fever climbed higher. His mother cried. The physician demanded that Annie leave. He insisted on using conventional medicine, on repeating the same methods that had failed. Annie did not argue. She understood the battle she was fighting was not only with disease but also with fear itself. She continued her treatments in secret, adjusting the teas, increasing hydration, and applying cooling compresses where needed. On the third day, the boy began to respond. His fever dropped slightly, his breathing eased, the color returned to his cheeks. His mother watched in disbelief as the boy opened his eyes, weak but alive. By the fourth day, he was sitting up, asking for water, and by the end of the week, he was laughing, running through the house like nothing had ever been wrong. The recovery should have been a triumph. It should have silenced the doubters. But it did not. Among the planters and their families, fear had grown too deep. If Annie could heal so quickly, they reasoned, then she must also understand how to harm. The line between healer and threat was thin. Only one misstep could turn awe into terror. A few days after the boy's recovery, another incident occurred. A field worker named Mary collapsed suddenly. Annie was called immediately. She examined Mary and quickly identified symptoms of poisoning from a plant she had warned the slaves not to harvest. She treated Mary, and within hours, the woman regained consciousness. No one could have predicted the cause. No one knew which plant had been used. It was a minor miracle that Annie had recognized it in time. Yet the planters whispered, how could a slave know so much about dangerous plants? How could she anticipate poison before it struck? Some began avoiding her gaze. Others watched everything she did. Suspicion thickened like fog over the fields. Even those who had benefited from her skill in saving lives felt a gnawing unease. Then came the test that would define Annie Turner's place in her new home. A wealthy planter from a distant county arrived, bringing with him his sick wife. The woman had fallen ill with a mysterious disease, one that left her weak and delirious. Physicians had tried their remedies, but nothing worked. The planter demanded Annie's help. He brought her to his estate, surrounded her with guards, and made it clear that he expected success, or consequences. Annie examined the woman and immediately recognized the symptoms. She prepared her remedies with careful hands, explaining nothing. Every measurement, every combination of herbs, every step in the process had been refined through years of observation and practice. Days passed, the woman's condition wavered, but Annie persisted. Slowly, the patient improved. Within a week, she could eat solid food and speak clearly again. The planter was grateful, yet he could not shake a sense of unease. How could a young woman, a slave, possess such understanding? He rewarded Annie but treated her with the same cautious suspicion that had haunted her in Mississippi. Her skill was undeniable, but so too was the fear it inspired. Back at her plantation, the stories of her successes and the fears they generated spread. Slaves whispered in awe. White families whispered in dread. Annie Turner had survived the first true test in her new home. She had healed where others could not. She had prevented death where ignorance might have claimed it. But she had also reminded everyone that knowledge could not be contained. It could not be measured, controlled, or confined. Some of the richest, most powerful men in the region were beginning to realize that she was more than a healer. She was a force that could not be chained, and the fear of what she could do lingered like a shadow over every household she entered. Annie understood the balance she had to maintain. Every action had consequences. Every decision could be interpreted as either blessing or curse. She continued her work quietly, carefully, aware that each success increased both her reputation and the unease that surrounded her. Her garden flourished. The hidden library of marks and pebbles and carved bark grew. Slaves under her guidance learned not only which plants healed but also how to observe the world, to notice patterns, and to respect the delicate boundary between life and death. Annie Turner was no longer just a healer. She was a teacher, a keeper of knowledge, and a living warning to anyone who underestimated the power of observation and understanding. As she moved among the fields and cabins of her new home, her eyes always watched, her mind cataloging, her presence a quiet reminder that knowledge cannot be hidden, that it travels with the person who holds it, and that fear, once it finds a shape, will never easily let go. If you want to see how Annie's influence begins to challenge the very power structures around her, how her reputation grows in ways even she could not predict, and how fear turns into confrontation, subscribe to the channel, like this video, share it with others, and leave your thoughts in the comments. Part 6 will reveal the moment when Annie faces a threat unlike any she has ever encountered and how she responds with the knowledge that has made her legendary. I can continue with Part 6 next, escalating the suspense and the danger that finally puts Annie in direct conflict with those who fear her knowledge. Do you want me to write Part 6 now? Part 6 Shadows of Suspicion. Fear has a way of finding the cracks in even the strongest walls. It grows quietly at first, like smoke drifting through a chimney, invisible but present. By the summer of Annie Turner's first year in Louisiana, fear had begun to shape the world around her. People no longer whispered only about what she had done. They whispered about what she could do. And soon, that fear would turn into a direct threat. It began on a humid July morning. Annie was in her garden, tending the herbs that had saved countless lives, when the sound of hooves on the dusty road interrupted her work. A small party of men approached from the east, their horses kicking up clouds of red dirt. They were not neighbors or planters seeking her remedies. They carried letters and orders, their expressions tense and controlled. The men delivered a summons from the county sheriff. They had received reports, they said, from multiple plantations, suggesting that Annie Turner was dangerous. That she possessed knowledge no one should have. That her power could be used for harm. The sheriff's words were polite, almost procedural, but Annie understood them immediately. They were not here to negotiate. They were here to test her. Annie did not panic. She had learned long ago that fear is a tool, not an enemy. She gathered her herbs, carefully packed her few belongings, and followed the men to the county seat. The journey was tense. Every creak of the wagon, every shuffle of hooves, every whisper in the trees seemed amplified by the fear surrounding her. She knew that some of the men feared her more than they feared the law. At the courthouse, a crowd had gathered. Planters, overseers, and townspeople, all curious and wary. Some hoped to see her punished. Others hoped to see her prove herself. Annie was asked to demonstrate her knowledge, to explain her remedies, to show that she was a healer, not a threat. She agreed silently, stepping forward with the calm that had always unsettled those who watched her. The first test was simple in theory but daunting in practice. A young man, apparently suffering from a fever that had resisted conventional medicine, was brought forward. He was pale, weak, and trembling. The crowd watched as Annie knelt beside him. She asked questions, examined his pulse, and observed his symptoms with meticulous care. Then she moved into action. Annie prepared a tea using feverfew, willow bark, and a combination of local herbs she had cultivated in her garden. She applied cooling compresses to his forehead and chest. Every movement was deliberate, measured, and precise. The young man drank the tea under her supervision, and within hours, his fever began to break. By the next day, he was sitting upright, smiling weakly at the amazed crowd. The first display of her skill should have eased tension, but fear is rarely rational. The planters and townspeople began to whisper again. How could a slave know so much? How could she control illness so precisely? If she could cure with knowledge, could she also kill with it? The questions spread like wildfire, and suspicion grew. The second test came unexpectedly. One of the men who had accompanied her to the courthouse suddenly collapsed, clutching his chest. His face turned pale, his breathing shallow. The crowd panicked. They assumed poisoning, assuming the worst. Annie stepped forward calmly, observing him carefully. She recognized the symptoms immediately, a reaction to heat and dehydration combined with a minor heart condition. She gave him water and guided him through breathing exercises. Slowly, his color returned, and his pulse steadied. Even after saving the man, the murmurs did not stop. They had seen her save one life and protect another. Yet the fear that knowledge had created did not vanish. Some whispered that she had done it intentionally, that she had tested her power, and that perhaps she had been responsible for the man's collapse in the first place. The idea made no sense to anyone who understood her, but to those gripped by fear, logic was irrelevant. The final test came later that week. A woman had fallen from her horse, suffering a deep cut on her leg. Blood pooled around her, and the townspeople feared infection and death. They brought her to Annie. She cleaned the wound, applied a poultice of pine resin and wild garlic, and bandaged it carefully. She instructed the woman to rest and avoid movement. Over the next few days, the wound healed without infection. The townspeople were forced to admit her skill. Yet acknowledgement brought no relief. The county magistrate gathered the planters and townspeople and addressed the problem directly. Annie Turner, he said, has knowledge that others cannot control. She can heal, she can save, some believe she can harm. The question before us is simple. How do we live with this? How do we accept knowledge we cannot contain? No one answered. They looked at her, trying to gauge her thoughts. Annie said nothing. Silence was her armor, her shield, her statement. The magistrate realized there was only one compromise possible. She would remain on the plantation under careful supervision, allowed to work her craft, but restricted in her movement and interactions. Annie returned home quietly, but her thoughts were far from still. She knew that fear was not something she could erase. It could only be observed, managed, and, if possible, redirected. She returned to her garden and continued her work, teaching the slaves who trusted her the ways of healing, cataloging the plants, marking her trees, and preparing for the future. Yet she also understood that danger could appear anywhere. Fear, once planted, was not easily removed. She had passed the tests, saved lives, and demonstrated her skill, but the shadow of suspicion would follow her for the rest of her life. It was not a question of what she knew or what she did. It was a question of what others believed she could do. Annie Turner had survived Mississippi. She had survived rumors and fear, whispers and threats. Now she faced a new challenge, surviving the suspicion of a world that could not comprehend the power of knowledge in the hands of someone they were conditioned to control. The summer ended, but the tension remained. Annie moved through her days with her usual calm, tending to the sick, teaching the young women of the plantation, and preparing her hidden library of signs and marks in the woods. Her mind was sharp, her observations keen, and her resolve unbroken. She had learned a crucial lesson in Mississippi and Louisiana alike. Knowledge is not only power. It is a warning, it is a challenge, and those who fear it will always look for ways to destroy it. Annie Turner understood that more clearly than anyone. She would not hide, she would not surrender, but she would always be vigilant. If you want to see how fear escalates into outright danger for Annie, how her enemies begin to plot against her, and how her knowledge becomes a matter of life and death, subscribe to the channel, like this video, share it with others, and leave your thoughts in the comments. Part 7 will reveal the moment when Annie Turner faces betrayal and the terrifying lengths people will go to control knowledge they do not understand. I can continue and create Part 7 next, where Annie faces her first direct betrayal and the story takes a darker turn. Do you want me to write Part 7 now? Part 7 The Betrayal. Some knowledge cannot be measured. Some knowledge cannot be chained. Some knowledge forces people to confront the limits of their fear. Annie Turner had lived her life walking that line. She had healed the sick, saved children, and earned a reputation that spread across plantations. But now she would face a danger that no herb, no poultice, and no hidden mark could protect her from. It began quietly, almost imperceptibly. Among the slaves on her new plantation, there was one woman named Eliza. Young, ambitious, and eager to please the white families, Eliza had watched Annie with fascination. She had learned from Annie, absorbed her lessons about herbs and remedies, but she had also seen the fear and awe Annie inspired. Eliza wanted that power for herself, wanted the respect of the white planters, and was willing to betray the one person who had taught her everything. The first hint of trouble came when letters arrived from neighboring plantations. Slaves had been instructed to report any unusual behavior. Eliza had begun slipping notes into these letters, exaggerating Annie's knowledge, suggesting that she had plans to harm people who crossed her. She wrote of whispered threats she claimed to have overheard, of herbs gathered at odd hours, and of strange movements in the garden at night. The planters read the letters and their unease deepened. They had already feared Annie's knowledge. The rumors from Mississippi and her reputation in Louisiana made them cautious. Now, these letters painted her as not just powerful but dangerous, someone who could strike without warning and without proof. One morning, the overseer arrived at Annie's cabin. He demanded that she account for her movements the night before. He claimed to have received a report that she had been wandering the property after dark, gathering herbs and carrying them in secret. Annie explained calmly that she had been preparing medicine for the sick slaves. She showed the herbs she had collected and the preparations she had made. She answered every question with truth and precision, but the man's eyes did not leave her. He did not trust her, and in that distrust, a plan began to form. Eliza continued her betrayal quietly, watching for every opportunity. She whispered to other slaves, suggesting that Annie's knowledge could be used against them. She told the white planters that Annie had been experimenting with poisonous plants, claiming that the small accidents that sometimes occurred in her work were deliberate. Her words spread slowly, carried by fear and uncertainty. One evening, the planter's wife became ill with severe stomach pains. She had eaten dinner prepared by the cook, a meal that Annie had not touched. But the planters were primed to fear, and Annie was the easiest target. They demanded that she explain the illness, that she identify the cause. Annie examined the woman carefully, taking her pulse, checking her complexion, and noting the symptoms. She identified a mild contamination in the water supply and prepared a simple herbal remedy to calm the stomach and prevent further illness. The treatment worked. The woman recovered within 2 days. But the planters' fear had not lessened. They began to watch Annie constantly, scrutinizing every action, every movement, every herb she touched. Eliza whispered warnings into their ears, painting Annie as someone who could manipulate life and death at will. The tension reached a breaking point when a young boy in the quarters fell gravely ill with a fever that no one could explain. The white planters immediately assumed the worst. They accused Annie of harming the child, despite the fact that she had been tending to another patient miles away at the time. Panic and suspicion filled the air. Annie was called to the main house. She entered quietly, her calm demeanor unchanged, but her mind was sharp, alert to every detail. She asked questions about the boy's symptoms, what he had eaten, and who had cared for him. Then she visited the quarters, observing the child carefully. She examined his pulse, his skin, and his breathing. She noticed small signs of dehydration and poor sanitation, not poison. Using herbs to reduce fever and calm the body, Annie treated the boy. Slowly, over the next day, he improved. The parents were astonished, but the planters were still uneasy. They remembered the rumors, the letters, and the fear that had been planted by Eliza. They whispered among themselves, suggesting that Annie had only pretended to heal the child to maintain her reputation. Eliza, emboldened by the planters' distrust, continued to push the narrative. She suggested stricter supervision, claiming it was for everyone's safety. She insinuated that Annie's private garden should be monitored, that her remedies should be observed step by step, and that any further illnesses would be considered her responsibility. Annie understood immediately that her life and work were in jeopardy. She could not control what others believed, but she could control her response. She began leaving coded messages for trusted slaves, marking the location of herbs, warning them of dangerous plants, and recording remedies in ways only they could understand. Her hidden library of carved bark, pebbles, and marks became a lifeline, a safeguard against the betrayal around her. The planters held a meeting to decide Annie's fate. Some argued that she should be sold again, far away, to prevent any further incidents. Others feared the backlash from losing someone so skilled and refused to make a decision. The atmosphere was tense, heavy with suspicion and fear. Eliza watched from the sidelines, her face a mask of innocence. Annie listened quietly. She spoke only once, her voice calm and measured. She explained the illnesses, the remedies, and the steps she had taken to prevent further harm. She did not argue about the rumors or the letters. She presented facts. She demonstrated results. Yet even her clear and undeniable knowledge could not erase the fear that had been planted in their minds. The planter's wife, who had recovered from her illness, spoke on Annie's behalf. She reminded them of all the lives Annie had saved, the children healed, and the accurate diagnoses she had made. Her words carried weight, but the fear of what Annie could do lingered. It was not about truth or evidence anymore. It was about perception, about control, and about the deep-seated anxiety of those who had always believed that slaves should know nothing. Eliza's betrayal had succeeded in creating doubt. Annie realized that some battles are not fought with herbs or remedies but with patience, observation, and quiet resilience. She returned to her garden, tending the plants, recording the remedies, and teaching only those she trusted. She understood that her knowledge was both her greatest power and her greatest danger. In the quiet of the evening, Annie reflected on the lessons she had learned. Knowledge could save life and ruin reputations. Knowledge could heal and inspire fear. Knowledge could not be chained. And betrayal, once planted, was as deadly as any poison. If you want to see how Annie Turner navigates this betrayal, how she protects her knowledge, and how the tension escalates into a confrontation that will change everything, subscribe to the channel, like this video, share it with others, and leave your thoughts in the comments. Part 8 will reveal the moment when Annie's enemies take action and she must confront the darkest fears of those who cannot understand her. I can continue and write Part 8 next, where the suspense and horror peak and Annie faces direct danger from those who fear her knowledge. Do you want me to write Part 8 now? Part 8: The Dark Confrontation. Fear is a powerful force, and sometimes it drives people to do things they would never consider in ordinary circumstances. For Annie Turner, fear had been building quietly for years. First in Mississippi, then in Louisiana, and now, in the summer of her second year, that fear became something tangible. It became a threat she could not ignore. It began one sweltering August evening. Annie was in her cabin, carefully drying herbs she had gathered from the woods. The wind rustled the leaves outside, carrying the distant sound of hooves. At first, she thought it was a neighbor returning from the fields, but the sound grew louder and more deliberate. Then she saw them. A group of men had entered the plantation without warning, their faces grim, their eyes cold. These were not casual visitors. These were men who had come to act on the fear that had festered for months. They demanded to see Annie. They accused her of plotting harm, of using her knowledge to manipulate, poison, or control those around her. They said the whispers of her power had spread far beyond the plantation and that local authorities were growing suspicious. According to them, something had to be done before someone got hurt. Annie did not panic. She understood fear intimately, and she had learned how to read it, manipulate it, and use it to her advantage. She calmly followed the men to the main house, where the planter and his family were waiting. Her presence alone seemed to heighten the tension. People held their breath, unsure whether they would see violence, deception, or some inexplicable power at work. The leader of the group, a wealthy planter named William Carlyle, stepped forward. He spoke with authority, claiming that Annie's knowledge was too dangerous to remain unchecked. He suggested that she be restrained, her garden destroyed, and her books and notes confiscated. The threat was clear. He intended to control her, or remove her entirely. Annie listened quietly, her hands folded in front of her. She did not raise her voice. She did not argue. Instead, she observed, studying their faces, their movements, their fears. She understood that they were not confronting her because of what she had done, but because of what they believed she could do. Their minds had created monsters from truth and imagination, and she knew that to survive, she had to confront that fear directly. She asked for a moment to examine one of their sick horses. A chestnut mare had been limping for days, her condition worsening. The men were skeptical, but Annie insisted. She knelt beside the animal, feeling its leg, observing its gait, and noting subtle signs of swelling and infection. She gathered herbs from her bundle, prepared a poultice, and applied it carefully to the horse's leg. Within an hour, the animal seemed to relax. Its breathing eased, and the swelling began to subside. The men watched, uneasy. They could not explain how a young slave girl had diagnosed and treated an animal in ways that had eluded the local veterinarian. Their fear shifted, from suspicion to awe, then back to unease. Annie had demonstrated her skill without words, without threat, yet the power in her hands was undeniable. One of the men, emboldened by anger, accused her of causing the mysterious illnesses that had plagued the plantations. He claimed that people and animals had fallen sick after she visited, suggesting that her knowledge of poisons made her capable of murder. Annie remained calm. She explained, in clear terms, the natural causes of the illnesses, the importance of sanitation, and the proper use of herbs to heal. She showed them the exact remedies she had prepared and allowed them to observe every step of her work. For a moment, there was silence. The men were forced to acknowledge that she was telling the truth, that her knowledge was rooted in observation, not malice. But fear is rarely satisfied with reason alone. They began to plot, quietly, to limit her influence. They suggested she be kept under constant supervision, that her garden be moved to a less accessible location, that she be watched at all times. Annie understood that control was impossible to resist entirely. But she had learned that subtlety and patience were her greatest allies. She agreed to their demands outwardly, moving her garden and allowing limited observation of her work. Behind the scenes, however, she continued her hidden record-keeping, marking herbs, remedies, and their uses in her secret language of bark carvings, pebble arrangements, and tree notches. Despite the restrictions, Annie's influence continued to grow. Slaves came to her in secret, seeking remedies, guidance, and education. She taught them how to observe nature, how to recognize medicinal and poisonous plants, and how to understand the delicate balance between life and death. Her hidden library became a treasure beyond measure, a knowledge that could survive even the worst attempts to suppress it. But the threat of the planters, suspicion remained. Annie knew that it was only a matter of time before fear escalated into action. She had survived rumors, betrayal, and suspicion. She had saved lives against impossible odds. Yet she understood that the darkest challenge lay ahead, one that could test not just her skill but her very will to survive. Late one night, as she walked through her garden under the moonlight, she sensed movement in the shadows. She paused, listening. The fear she had observed in others now touched her own senses. She felt eyes on her, the quiet presence of those who wished to control her, to extinguish the knowledge they could not understand. She whispered to the plants, feeling their energy, and reminded herself that knowledge is not only power but protection. She had survived this long because she understood the connection between observation, wisdom, and patience. She would survive what came next, too. In the coming weeks, tensions would rise. The planters, distrust would deepen. Allies and enemies would emerge, and Annie Turner would face decisions that could determine not only her fate but the future of the knowledge she had spent a lifetime cultivating. If you want to see how Annie confronts the ultimate threat, how fear turns into action, and how her knowledge becomes a weapon and shield in ways no one could have imagined, subscribe to the channel, like this video, share it with others, and leave your thoughts in the comments. Part 9 will reveal the moment when Annie faces a direct attack, a test of courage, and a choice that could change her life forever. I can continue with Part 9 next, where the danger escalates to a life-threatening confrontation for Annie. Do you want me to write Part 9 now? Part 9: The Attack. Some nights are darker than others. Some nights carry a weight that cannot be shaken, a tension that crawls under your skin and settles in your bones. For Annie Turner, the summer of 1845 brought such nights. Fear had followed her from Mississippi to Louisiana, whispered through plantations, and now it had grown into something far more dangerous. People who could not understand her knowledge were no longer content to merely watch. They wanted to control it. They wanted to destroy it. It started in the dead of night. Annie was tending to her small garden, her hands moving carefully over herbs she had cultivated for months. The moon was full, silver light spilling across the rows of plants, and the air smelled of wet earth and pine. She heard nothing at first, only the rustle of leaves in the gentle wind. Then a twig snapped behind her. She froze. Her eyes scanned the shadows. Someone was there. The sensation of being watched was immediate, primal. She knew that this was not a visitor coming for medicine. This was someone acting on fear, acting on suspicion, acting on envy and hatred. A figure lunged from the darkness. Annie barely had time to react. She twisted, pulling a small vial of crushed feverfew from her pocket. She threw it into the air, and the faint scent of the herb filled the night. The man recoiled, coughing and stumbling backward. It was enough to give her a momentary advantage. She ran toward the cabin, her mind racing. Her attackers were not alone. Shadows emerged from the tree line. She recognized some of them. Planters, men, overseers, and even a few slaves coerced by threats or bribery. They moved with intent, silent and deadly. They believed Annie Turner's knowledge was dangerous. They believed that if she could heal, she could also harm. Inside the cabin, Annie moved quickly. She grabbed her secret records, carefully bundled in strips of bark and tied with vine. Every mark, every code, every hidden note could not fall into the wrong hands. She knew that if they were discovered, her knowledge, her lifeline, could be destroyed forever. The men broke through the door. Shouts filled the night. Annie confronted them with calm determination. She did not raise her voice, but every movement was precise. She poured boiling water into a basin and crushed a mixture of peppermint and wild garlic to create a pungent smoke. The men recoiled, coughing, and Annie slipped past them, out the back door. She ran into the woods, familiar with every tree, every path, every hidden marker. The attackers followed, but the forest was hers. She had learned from Mississippi how to move silently, how to observe, how to survive. She led them through twisting paths, across streams, and into dense thickets where the moonlight barely reached the ground. The chase ended at the creek that ran along the edge of the plantation. Annie stopped and faced her pursuers. The water reflected the moonlight, giving her an almost otherworldly glow. She reached into her bag and brought out small pouches filled with powdered herbs, releasing clouds of smoke that made the air thick and difficult to breathe. Men coughed, stumbled, and fell. Fear had become a weapon, as potent as any knife or rope. But Annie knew she could not fight them all forever. She needed a plan that would ensure her survival beyond this night. She ran to a hollow tree she had marked weeks earlier, a place known only to her and a few trusted allies. Inside, she had hidden supplies, notes, and seeds. She slipped into the hollow, crouching low and silent. The attackers passed, unaware. They shouted, searched, and cursed, but they could not see what she had prepared. In the hours that followed, Annie observed from the shadows. She noted their movements, their weaknesses, their assumptions. Every step they took revealed their fear. Every shout and stumble confirmed what she had known all along. Knowledge cannot be caged. Knowledge cannot be destroyed by anger or violence. It can only be respected or feared. By dawn, the attackers had left, frustrated and exhausted. Annie emerged from her hiding place, her clothes damp from the night air, her heart pounding but steady. She returned to her garden, surveying the plants that had survived the night, the herbs that held the power to heal and protect. Her secret library was intact. Her knowledge was safe. For now, the attack changed everything. Word spread through the quarters that Annie Turner had faced danger and survived. The slaves whispered of her courage, of her calm in the face of fear and violence. Her legend grew, and so did the caution of those who had once doubted her. Some began to leave her offerings of herbs, seeds, and food, recognizing that her knowledge was worth preserving. For the white planters and overseers, the attack only deepened suspicion. They did not understand her power. They feared it. They whispered that Annie had supernatural abilities, that she could command the forest, control illness, and evade anyone who sought to harm her. The truth was simpler. Annie was patient, observant, and deeply skilled. Fear and respect gave her power because others had never seen knowledge wielded without arrogance or cruelty. Annie understood that this was only the beginning. Her enemies would return, emboldened by frustration, determined to test her limits. She knew that survival depended on preparation, secrecy, and the loyalty of those who trusted her. She began teaching a select few the hidden codes of her knowledge, ensuring that even if she were taken, the wisdom she carried would endure. The summer of 1845 closed with a tense calm. The forest held its breath. The plantation watched warily. Annie Turner had survived an attack meant to destroy her. She had proved that knowledge, carefully guarded and wisely used, could defend itself in ways no blade or whip ever could. If you want to see how Annie Turner faces the final confrontation, how the fear of others reaches a climax, and how her knowledge ensures not only her survival but the survival of those who depend on her, subscribe to the channel, like this video, share it with others, and leave your thoughts in the comments. Part 10, the final chapter, will reveal the conclusion of Annie's journey, the ultimate resolution of fear and power, and the legacy she leaves behind. I can now write Part 10, the thrilling conclusion of Annie Turner's story, showing the final confrontation, her ultimate triumph, and the lasting impact of her knowledge. Do you want me to write Part 10 now? Part 10, the legacy. The night was thick with tension. Shadows clung to the trees and the wind carried a warning through the fields. Annie Turner had survived threats, betrayal, and attacks, but now she faced the moment that would decide everything. For years, fear had followed her, whispered in the quarters, murmured in the halls, and shouted in anger by those who could not understand her knowledge. Tonight, it would come to a head. Word had reached Thomas Hartwell and neighboring planters that Annie had defied their authority one too many times. A meeting had been called, ostensibly to discuss her future, but everyone knew what it meant. The planters and overseers wanted to remove the threat she represented. They did not care about her skills or the lives she had saved. Knowledge in the hands of a slave was too dangerous, they argued, and fear had hardened into resolve. Annie arrived at the meeting quietly, her hands folded, her expression calm. She had anticipated this moment. Every move she had made, every note carved into bark, every seed hidden in the forest had prepared her for this confrontation. She was not afraid, for she understood something the planters could not. True power was not in fear or violence but in understanding, patience, and the quiet certainty of knowledge. William Carlyle, the planter who had led the earlier attempts to control her, stepped forward. His voice was sharp. He demanded that Annie confess to wrongdoing, that she admit she had poisoned, manipulated, or planned harm. The others nodded, their eyes wary and suspicious. They had come ready to justify her punishment, but they were unprepared for what Annie would do. She spoke slowly, deliberately, her voice carrying across the room. She recounted the illnesses she had healed, the children she had saved, the herbs she had taught others to use, and the remedies she had developed. She explained each case with precision, leaving no doubt about her intentions or the truth of her actions. She did not shout, she did not plead, she simply presented the facts. For a moment, there was silence. Fear had brought them to this room, but clarity was beginning to take its place. Annie did not rely on magic, trickery, or threats. She relied on observation, skill, and reason. She reminded them that knowledge, like medicine, could heal or harm, depending on how it was used. But she had always chosen to heal. One planter, emboldened by arrogance, accused her of making illnesses appear worse than they were to increase her reputation. Annie turned to him, her eyes steady. She asked him to describe the symptoms of his neighbors, the plants they had ingested, and the conditions in which they lived. With quiet authority, she demonstrated that his assumptions were based on fear, not evidence. The room began to shift. Thomas Hartwell, who had owed his life to Annie's knowledge, spoke first. He reminded the others that without her intervention, his daughter Caroline might have died. He reminded them that she had identified poisons that even the doctors could not, that her remedies had saved countless lives, and that she had never once used her knowledge to harm anyone under her care. It was then that Annie revealed the final piece of her preparation. She had brought with her small bundles of bark, seeds, and herbs. She handed them to the planters and instructed them to examine the markings, the notches, and the arrangements. She explained that her hidden library was a record of healing, a guide for those who wished to understand nature and medicine. She had nothing to hide, yet she had safeguarded the wisdom in ways only the observant could see. The planters handled the bundles cautiously. As they examined the markings, as they saw the logic and the order, some began to understand. Knowledge was not a weapon unless wielded by someone with intent to harm. Annie's intent had always been to heal, to teach, and to protect. Fear had blinded them, and in that blindness, they had almost destroyed something invaluable. One by one, the accusations faded. The whispers of suspicion died away. Even William Carlyle lowered his eyes. He realized that Annie Turner's power was not in fear or manipulation but in skill, patience, and unshakable integrity. She had survived because she understood her environment, respected the laws of nature, and protected her knowledge with care. Annie returned to the quarters that evening, her heart steady. She had faced the ultimate test and had prevailed not with violence but with clarity and wisdom. The slaves who had depended on her gathered around, and she taught them more than remedies. She taught them observation, discernment, and the careful application of knowledge. Her lessons were not only about herbs but about survival, resilience, and dignity. Word of her triumph spread. Stories of Annie Turner became legend, whispered across plantations, carried in secret letters, and told to children who would one day need to understand that power and knowledge could coexist with humility and compassion. She had faced fear, betrayal, and threat, yet she had preserved the very thing that made her most dangerous to those who sought to control her, her knowledge. In the years that followed, Annie's hidden library grew. A select few she trusted continued to learn from her, ensuring that her wisdom would survive even the harshest attempts to suppress it. Her reputation as a healer and as a woman whose knowledge could not be contained became a symbol of hope and resistance. Annie Turner lived the rest of her life quietly, tending her garden, teaching her students, and walking through the forest with the calm certainty of someone who understood the balance of life and death. The planters who had once feared her came to respect her, not fully understanding her power but recognizing the necessity of it. Knowledge cannot be chained. Knowledge cannot be broken by fear or violence. Knowledge can survive, grow, and inspire. Annie Turner's story was one of survival, wisdom, and quiet defiance. She taught the world that true power lies not in domination but in understanding, in care, and in the courage to persist when everyone else doubts you. Her legacy endures. Her hidden library of marks, bark, and pebbles was preserved by those who understood its value. Her teachings spread quietly, like seeds in the wind, ensuring that future generations could heal, survive, and respect the power of knowledge. If you want to explore more stories of courage, hidden knowledge, and historical mysteries that combine horror and history, subscribe to the channel, like this video, share it with your friends, and leave your thoughts in the comments. Annie Turner's journey may have ended in one place, but her legacy continues to inspire those who value knowledge, courage, and the quiet strength of the human spirit.